That's wrong. Okay. All right. So, happy days. I just realized that apparently I've been walking all the way over there to turn the lights down, and I just realized that there's a switch here. So there you go. Super smart. It's not the first time I've had classes in this room either. So apparently, either I've learned this in the past and forgot, or I just never knew. Okay, a couple of quick things. So today, we're going to go into our second last topic, which is on mental health. Talk about that a little bit. Our last topic is sort of youth and technology. So we'll bridge that today. We'll go through mental health. Whatever time we have left today, we're gonna look at like a documentary. So I will put that on in the back half of the course, which kind of bridges that in and gives us a little bit of insight on the tech industry in particular and its approach to people, young people in particular. And then next time we'll finish up talking about kind of young people and technology, looking at some arguments from Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. Other things, midterm point, I just kind of ran aground and, they're long answers, so it takes a while to mark all of them. So should have it done today, though. If not, tomorrow morning, it will be task number 1. Okay, anything you want to ask before I jump in here? Nay. Okay, let's do it. Wait, haha, sorry. The final. It's going to be 5. I'm just going to make it 5. Yeah, I'm just going to make it 5. I made it 5 in the winter, and I'll just make it 5 again, and it'll be awesome. Just 5 questions, and yeah, it'll be the same amount of time. So I am cutting out a lot on the live stream. Interesting. I will attempt to figure that out. Sorry, what was your question? Yeah, I'll just open it up on the 12th and 13th and do it whenever you want on those 2 days. Properties? I don't know if that is better. Is that better? Person on live stream? Sometimes if it auto selects the microphone on my laptop, it doesn't follow me around quite as well. If you could comment, do you hear me better now? Okay. Interesting. How's that? I'm not going to spend too much time trying to fix this. Can you hear me now? Anything? Bueller? No. Oh, this is why you should just come to class instead of sitting at home. Is that better? Okay. Not sure. Is that better? You can hear me. Okay. Apparently my microphone is having a conniption, which I hope it's dead because they're expensive. You're watching it, it's fine for you. Okay. Fine, whatever. Just gonna try to talk directly to the microphone for the rest of the class and not walk around. Pass my steps anyway, I should be okay. All right. Good enough. You can hear, you can hear, you can fly, you can fly. Okay. So sorry. What's that? Yeah, exactly. It's all in my brain. See, you're a millennial, so you get it. Okay. So yeah, we're gonna talk about mental health a little bit today. Um, I used to have a really boring health unit that talked about all sorts of boring things. But I switched it mostly to mental health because I think it's the really interesting conversation, especially when we're talking about Gen Z. Okay, so big concerns with Gen Z. I think, we're going to talk a bunch of stuff, but loneliness is one of them, and I think one of the more interesting ones. So all of this data kind of put together by Springtide Institute, which is that same group that did the Faith Unbundled research on religion. Okay, so they kind of, they had this report in 2019 on young people. Well, sorry, they did the research in 2019. They put it out in 2020 on young people and kind of how they were doing. And they said, kind of gathering some of the research, loneliness has been a big problem for young people for a while. So they cite this research from Cigna, which is a think tank, um, which they did a study of 20,000 U.S. adults 18 and older in 2018, and its chief finding on Gen Z was that Gen Z is the loneliest generation, and claims to be in worse health than older generations. Now, one of the interesting things, because, inevitably, and we'll talk about this when we talk about height, we see this a little bit with Gene Twenge's work as well. Smartphones and social media. You can tell I've taught intro to social research so many times that the word social immediately gets followed in my brain by research. Social media is not a predictor of loneliness. Heavy social media users and those who never use social media have similar scores. Now, why? Well, one of the things that Jonathan Haidt will talk about when it comes to social media is that we've set up what we could call sort of collective action problems. So, whether you use social media or not, right? The fact that virtually everybody in your community does use social media sets up a series of problems. That the social effect, like I could say, I'm not going to use social media, but because everybody else around me is, we're all going to experience any kind of social issues that social media might create roughly evenly because it's, those effects are distributed amongst the group. So whether you use social media or not, right? Like, you could throw away your smartphone tomorrow, stop using social media, get a Nokia flip phone, or I guess Nokia makes bar phones, or a flip phone of some kind, and it would basically make very little difference because it wouldn't change the behavior of everybody around you. Okay, so heavy and social media users report similar scores, right? So just stopping social media use, if social media is in fact a cause, doesn't seem to be effective. Okay, and I love this. So Ford Motor Company also does research. They do marketing research. So they did a 2020 national survey that they use for marketing. And it also identifies loneliness as one of the most pressing social issues confronting society. Okay. And what do they say in the report? They say generally trust in institutions, right? We talked about this a little bit when we talked about, Gen Z and Faith Unbundled, right? They're deinstitutionalizing. So trust in institutions and brands is declining. Obviously for Ford, that would be a big problem because they are a brand. And our examination of loneliness suggests that many people feel they lack trusting relationships with peers too, right? And without this bedrock of trust, people feel increased anxiety. And I do want to say the person who wrote this report has the job title that I think I will want until my dying days. It is Ford Motor Company's chief futurologist. And I don't know why, but I deeply want to be the chief futurologist of something. I don't even know what. It just sounds like a much cooler job title than, you know, or associate teaching professor. I'm like, yeah, that's good. Chief futurologist would be better. So if I ever get into it, maybe I'll negotiate my job title to include, associate teaching professor and chief futurologist of the Department of Sociology, and that will be very cool. Okay, so looking at this issue, right, wanting to ask a bunch of questions, but including questions on loneliness and Gen Z. Sorry, was your hand up or are you just stretching? Okay, sure. Okay, so I was like, so I wasn't sure. Okay, they did a study of 1,000 young people aged 13 to 25, with 35 qualitative interviews, right? And the loneliness portion, they use it's a 20 question tool, which is the UCLA Loneliness Index. So, Loneliness Index is a really well respected way of measuring kind of social connection and loneliness. It's mostly been used for seniors, right? Most of the time when we're talking about loneliness, we've been interested more in what senior citizens are feeling. And here it's a kind of novel application to apply it to, teens and emerging adults. So, what did they find? Many said they had high rates of loneliness, social isolation, and stress. And here's one of the things that kind of stuck out to me when I was reading this report is they asked questions, right, in those 35 qualitative interviews. They asked them, things like where they felt they belong, right? So where do these young people feel that they belong? Blue is a terrible highlighter color. I'll have to change that eventually. And what they said is for a lot of the Gen Zers in the sample, the question didn't make sense, right? Because belonging to them wasn't a question of where, so it's not a question of institutions, so not that, but it's actually a question of who, right? Who they feel like they belong to. So it's their idea of who, belonging comes down to individuals, to people. People make them feel like they belong. Institutions are just kind of incidental. And you can kind of see some of that with the faith unbundled stuff that we talked about before, right? This idea that, they are willing to move in and out of institutional settings based on the possibility of meaningful relationships, but that the institutions are always kind of secondary to that. Okay, so here, we don't need to worry too much about the differences in the lines here, but what do we see? 1 in 3 young people reported feeling completely alone much of the time, right? And here, just because they do research on religion, being part of a religious community didn't seem to provide much significant protection against loneliness. And here they're just kind of lumping anyone who's part of a religious community together, right? There's not a question of intensity or, how religious people are. Just going to a religious community didn't seem to help. Okay, so what did they find, right? In their total sample of young people. So percentage of our 13 to 25-year-olds who agree, responding sometimes or always with each statement. So sometimes or always, almost 2/5 of the sample said they felt like they had no one to talk to. A third said they feel completely alone, always or sometimes. Better than 2/5 said they felt that no one understands them. Again, about a third said no one really knows them, and 2/5 said, or 41%, said it was difficult for them to make friends. Okay, so this is kind of how it breaks down in terms of, some of these other numbers, spacing them out between always and sometimes, and then the total. Okay, so nobody to talk to, right? 8%, so almost 1 in 10, right, said that they always have no one to talk to, and 31% said sometimes. 12%, so better than 1 in 10, said they always feel left out. A quarter of them said they sometimes feel left out. 7% say their social relationships feel superficial. A quarter said sometimes. This one really interests me. People are around me, but not with me, right? So 10% say that's always the case. And then, a further almost 30% say sometimes. Okay. So I'm going to comment on this for a second. So I think it kind of links into another book that's much earlier. Sherry Turkle. So Turkle, she's a human technology interaction scholar, a sociologist at MIT. And she wrote this book. She's written a bunch of books on kind of technology and human interaction. But the one I think kind of speaks to me in terms of this statement is called Alone Together. She wrote another one a few years later called Reclaiming Conversation, which kind of picks up on Alone Together's themes. But what was really interesting in that book was, she was talking to college students in particular, right? So 18 to kind of 24-year-olds generally. And one of the things that she noted was that increasingly what they were reporting was that they were with people, but when they were with people, either those people were distracted or they were. And what were they distracted by? Well, obviously smartphones, right? Smartphones, and through smartphones, social media, right? So you can be with people and those people are not really present, right? And I think this is what's kind of showing up here is, right? I'm sure you've all been with a group of people and half the group is on their phones, right? Like you go out to dinner with some friends and people kind of pop in and out of the conversation as they're checking their smartphones, right? They get notifications. They check their, if you haven't, that's wonderful. They check their notifications, right? In and out of kind of conversations. So people are with you, around you, but not with you. And I think that's kind of what's reflected. And it's an isolating kind of feeling. And then I feel isolated from others, right? 10% say always. So again, 1 in 10 young people say they always feel isolated from others. And a further 25% say sometimes. Okay. And yeah, social isolation as they're defining it here. And this is how the UCLA Loneliness Index defines it. The state of having no or little contact or experience of belonging to societal organizations or groups. Okay. So what is that, well, I guess I wanted to kind of link that back to some of the other things we have talked about through the course. And especially if you remember, again, we're talking in the religion unit, we talked about, adults, right? The role that adults play in the lives of young people in terms of good life outcomes. Okay, so I have it's not for a couple slides. I got ahead of myself. Hang on. Well, let's talk about this for a sec. So, in terms of meaningful social interactions, right? So, meaningful social interactions, how often do young people feel like they're having interactions in their day that is somehow meaningful to them? And again, I think what should be really concerning, we got nearly 1 out of 10 young people saying that they have 0 interactions, right? So, no social interactions in a day that feel meaningful. 57% say they have 1 to 3. And again, this is a fair range, 1 to 3. 3 might be kind of good. 1 is probably not enough meaningful interactions, but together, right, you have 66% of young people with 3 or fewer meaningful interactions with anyone in a typical day, right? So, lots. Almost 40% feel at times no one knows them. And again, if we go back to, what I was saying a couple slides ago, right? Their definition of belonging, right, is individuals, right? It's who. So feeling known by particular people is key for Gen Z to feeling like they belong anywhere, right? So individuals, how do you get to know them, right? It's through interactions. Now, I will say there's some good things, right? About a fifth are having 4 to 5 meaningful interactions a day, and a further 14% are having 5 plus. And we're gonna, say 5 plus interactions is going to be considerably better than fewer. Okay, I say okay too much. I really gotta stop. All right, half of young people in the survey said they experience multiple kind of stress factors, and you can kind of see them here, right? So 58% of them, answered they feel stressed or overwhelmed all the time. 2/3 said they don't feel like they have enough time to get everything done. That's so real. I totally understand that. 60% feel fatigued or tired even when they wake up after adequate sleep. And 56% said they have a hard time feeling relaxed, right? So these are stressors, right? These are signs that young people are under considerable strain. And half of young people, are mixing and matching some combination of these four descriptors. Okay. The other one that's kind of interesting in this report is this. Lots of them in those qualitative interviews noted that their stress and anxiety gets in the way of them building connections and belonging, right? So again, if if belonging equals people, but your stress stops you from connecting to people, then clearly that's a problem. I'm gonna say equals problem. Okay, that's the problem that's being outlined here, right? And or almost a third, or a little bit more than a third of young people reported having no one to turn to when they were stressed, right? So that is a lot of young people who felt like they had no one to turn to when they are stressed. Okay, I mean, I won't belabor this too much. This just kind of, illustrates young, kind of trust in institutions to illustrate that point that our young people are increasingly deinstitutionalized, right? So, young people's trust in institutions, and this is out of 10, right? And here, this is percentage answering that they trust particular institutions, and this is obviously out of 100, right? Because they're percentages. So, nonprofit organizations barely kind of cross the 50% trust barrier, right? Public schools, it's about a 5 out of 10 or a scale of 5 out of 10, right? So they're about a 5 out of 10 in terms of trust. Banks, apparently people trust banks more than I thought they would. Organized religion, comes in at less than half, right? Less than kind of a 50% score. And then, I will note that this is during, so what year is this? This would be during the first Trump presidency. So president and Congress at 3.9, kind of lowish. And then big business, 3.8. So nobody likes big business. And you can kind of see, right, if we look at this chart, it's kind of useful in delineating how things have changed. We've seen declines in trust in things like the medical system, the presidency, no surprise there. Television news, right, a good one. Though people didn't trust TV news that much in the 1970s. I like organized religion down here, 65 down to 36%. Banks, 60 down to 30. Public schools, was it 58 down to 29? So you just see a kind of decline, right? Without me circling every single number, a decline in institutional trust in general, right? So we see a kind of institutional collapse. There's basically, no institution aside from nonprofits that really breaks the 50% kind of mark in terms of trust. And then, decline. Basically, every institution that's listed here has seen declines in trust. Okay. So, do you remember that I told you when we were talking about youth and religion that one chart for me kind of explains a whole bunch of other things going on, with young people, right? That was the one where it was adult relationships. So, one of the things they asked in this Springtide Institute research was about trusted adults. Like, how many trusted adults did young people have? And then, right, they correlated that to their rates, at what level they answer these questions, right? So they sometimes or always agree with each of these questions, right? Okay, so, and I'm sorry, this year, for whatever reason, they did not release a digital version of this report. So I had to actually take a picture of the page out of the booklet. So it looks like garbage, but hopefully it kind of does the job. So what we see. So of our, 9% of young people who said they had, or was it? No, so that was interactions per day. Sorry. Did I? Okay, never mind. I don't remember what the percentages were. The weighting of it was. Oh, I have it here. 8% said they have no trusted adult. So of that 8%, right, you can see the intensity of all of these stress factors, right? So 62% who had zero trusted adults, right, said that they, feel completely alone. 70% said no one understands them. 59% said they feel left out. And 73% of them say that they feel, stressed and overwhelmed, right? So those are really, really high numbers, right? Those are easily majority territory for each of these descriptors. This is a super at-risk group. This is a group that is not doing great in a lot of ways, right? They're not thriving, they're not flourishing. Now, one trusted adult improves things, right? Suddenly, I feel completely alone goes down to 46%. No one understands them, drop 10% away. We get a 7% drop in feeling left out, and a much more modest drop in feeling stressed and overwhelmed, but still a drop nonetheless. 2 to 4 trusted adults, right? So that's 20, this is 23% of our young people, so just under a quarter. Half of them have 2 to 4, and you see the kind of vast improvement, right? It's 29% feel completely alone. 41% says, so now we're into minority territory. Substantial minority nonetheless. No one understands them. 37% say they feel left out, and they're still pretty stressed and overwhelmed, right? Still 57%. The real, I think, magic comes, at 5+, and that's 17%. So that's 52%. 17% of our sample. Look at that. Look at this number, right? They feel 9% said they feel completely alone, right? Compared to 62% with no trusted adults. And still, 46% with one, and 29%. That's 20% decline from our 2 to 4 group, right? 24%, no one understands them. So, right, like a 50% decline, rough, or not quite, but close. 21% said they feel left out, and they're still pretty stressed and overwhelmed, but they're the one group here that it's a plurality and not a majority of them that say that they feel stressed and overwhelmed. Okay, so relationship with even one trusted adult results in a 16% decrease in feelings of loneliness, right? So trusted adults decrease feelings of loneliness and isolation and stress. 2 to 4 decreases the feelings of not being understood 22%, right? So the more adults a young person is connected with, right? And again, this is our 13 to 25-year-olds, right? So at least a good chunk of this are emerging adults, right? They are college aged, um, kind of going through the end of high school and through their college years. The more adults, right? And these can be adults of different ages, but the more trusted adults they have, right? The better their outcomes in terms of all of these things, right? So you can see big mental health benefits to being more connected. So, what's one of the problems? Um, where do you find trusted adults, right? How are young people going to connect with trusted adults? Where are those kind of relationships possible, right? And I think the answer to that question used to be much more straightforward, right? It was in some kind of institutional setting. But increasingly, what we see with it was true with millennials, it's been true for a while, but it's much more true with Gen Z. Um, what institutions are Gen Z part of today? Less and less of them. And it's kind of funny. I don't know if I mentioned this when I was talking about religion because I can't remember half the things I say at this point. New information came out of the General Social Survey in the US, right? And Ryan Burge was kind of commenting on it on his Substack because people always ask him, oh, is our Gen Z becoming more interested in religion? Because there's this sort of like I think cultural meme, certainly amongst Christians, that there's some kind of Gen Z revival going on, and Gen Z is so much more religious than previous generations were. And he said, okay, well, based on their, the general social survey, only about 17% attend, religious services weekly. And I kind of was thinking about this because I was like, oh yeah, that's not very good. But if you look at the data across the board, that's true for Gen Z, not just in terms of, religion, it's everything. It's political parties, social clubs, sports teams. They do less of everything, right? And he had published another piece on his Substack, and it's like Gen Z is becoming shockingly antisocial, right? Um, and you can just see the kind of markers of all sorts of activities that Gen Z does. They've just declined tremendously. So you're not part of institutions. Where else do you find adults? And this is always the thing. I sometimes ask this question and maybe I'm giving away hints for the final exam. Maybe. And it kind of goes like, and everybody suddenly perks up and starts writing. Um, and it always kind of goes like this, right? I ask a question that's like, hey, you've graduated from U of A, right? You're off. You get a job with an organization or with the government, trying to improve the mental health of young people. Make one recommendation, and back it up with something from the course. And inevitably, I get we should have trained mentors, that connect with young people. And I always give that a sort of like chuckle and then a like 7 out of 10. Because I'm like, where are you going to find these trained mentors, right? Like, what what actual place are you going to get a bunch of adults? Like, find me a bunch of adults who just want to volunteer to hang out with teenagers. Good luck with that. I have teenagers at home; they're unpleasant. Um, Sadly, they're not the most fun to hang out with. They have a lot of attitude and they don't want to do anything. They want to play video games and be on their phones. But this is the kind of thing, right? Like you could be like, okay, we need a big brothers and sisters program with, trained volunteers to hang out and build relationships with teenagers. Um, where are you going to go that the teenagers are? Right? There used to be places where teenagers were. They were at the mall. They were in arcades. They were in school. They were in clubs and sports teams. And that's not completely untrue, but it's less true than it was in the past, right? You are seeing, and I think I had this at the beginning of the course, right? On average, compared to millennials at the same time, oops, that should be 1.5. Gen Z has 1.5 extra hours of leisure time a day. And where is that leisure time coming from? It's things they're not doing and places they aren't, right? So where are you going? Like they have 1.5 extra hours where they're not doing anything because they're not playing sports. They're not, you know, at some kind of club, right? They're music lessons, band, whatever it is that young people do, right? Church, youth group, whatever it is, they're spending about 1.5 extra hours per day not doing that stuff. And they spend it, with that, with some kind of screen. So if anyway, I'm ranting. I'm not ranting. I'm making a point. Um, Without those institutional contexts, this becomes a really hard problem to solve. Like, how do you move these people to here or here? I think is a real question, because if they're not, chances are, if I was guessing, right, if we took those kind of categories, that Smith and Denton had, those are the disengaged, right? But they're not just disengaged from religion; they're kind of disengaged from everything, increasingly. Okay, slide over. I've doodled enough. Okay, I mean, this just, shows you the difference in one chart between, our 0 trusted adults and our 5 trusted adults, right? I feel completely alone. Nearly 2/3 to less than 10%. No one understands me, 70% versus 24, right? So big decline there. 59 feeling left out, 59 to 21, and stressed or overwhelmed, 73 to 39, right? So, okay. So severe loneliness, social isolation, and stress can be substantially reduced by increasing the number of connections young adults have to trusted adults. But again, my question becomes how? Like, how are you going to do this in an atmosphere where it's really just hard to get people to do much of anything, right? This is, again, I don't want to blame Netflix for everything, but this is the Netflix effect, right? Your house is so darn entertaining, right? Maybe you were part of a bowling league in the past because your house was kind of boring, but then you get cable TV and then video games and then streaming, and suddenly your house is endlessly entertaining. And there's less motivation to get out there. Okay. All right. That was perfectly depressing, and I'm sorry. I must now prepare you for even more depressing things. Um, so, more mental health concerns. Here from Twenge et al. So Gene Twenge, the same person who wrote Generations and iGen, right? iGen, published this study on adolescent mental health in the Journal of Adolescence, and found that adolescent mental health, lest you think you're somehow alone, right? Wait, what color do I have here? Highlighter. Yellow. Was declining worldwide, right? We're going to take a look at this. Now, very, very important, all of this starts prior to COVID. Right. So a lot of people will be like, okay, yeah, but Gen Z lived through COVID, and that's obviously one of the things that's pushed mental health in a negative direction. All of this, and obviously this paper is published in 2021. So right in the midst of the worst of COVID, right? COVID made them worse, but everything starts here before COVID. And the date so Haidt, we'll talk about him later, Twenge, and then Zach Rausch, who works with both of them, all point to like 2010 to 2012 as kind of critical dates here. Any guesses as to why? What's interesting about 2010, 2012? No guesses? The iPad is a good guess. What year, do you know what year the iPhone came out? 2007, close. So 2007 is the iPhone. 2010, kind of 2010 to 2012 is roughly the period where it hits kind of saturation, right? Where it's about half of all Americans have a smartphone by 2010, 2012, which by the way is one of the quickest upticks of a technology in history, right? Like it usually takes a long time for people to, take up a technology, but smartphones was really quick. And by the time we get, here it's like 75% of teenagers and like 94% of emerging adults have a smartphone. Okay, so the mental health effects that we're going to talk about, right? Um, Affecting both males and females, but the effects are mostly more pronounced in females. We'll talk about this a little bit, right, in women and girls. Um, and I think I'm going to make the case, and I think, certainly both Twenge and Height make the case that this has something to do with declines in time spent with other people, right, with other individuals. And obviously deinstitutionalization, I've been beating on this. I beat on this so hard, by the way, that I have people come take other courses with me, and deinstitutionalization shows up in all of their answers because they know how strongly I feel about it, and I do, and I think it's right. Okay, so let's talk some numbers and kind of trends. So this data comes to us from the Center for Disease Control, right, in Atlanta, Georgia. The Center for Disease Control is this American body that tracks a whole bunch of health measures, sometimes around disease, but around other things as well. And this is from a particular survey that they do on odd numbered years. So it's odd numbered years. This is a 10-year span. It's called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. So what do we see? Okay, this one, top one. Experience persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. So that number was 28% in 2011 and 42% by 2021. Okay, but let's leave out the COVID years. 2019, COVID hadn't hit yet. It had still jumped 9%, right? Kind of tracked steady through here. But by 2019, really jumps 9%. And then another, 5% in 2021. So this trend, the stop sign says bad trend. Bad trend. Trending upwards, right? Poor mental health, don't have a trend because they just started asking the question in the 2021 version of the survey. So we don't know. Seriously considered attempting suicide, right? Again, you have slow kind of growth there. 3%. Now, 3% growth could be just a difference in the margin of error, right? Like it's sort of within the margin of error of studies like this. It could be just the sample that you happen to be pulling. But it does look like an upward trajectory. And then obviously that COVID year, it's way up. Made a suicide plan. Again, like this looks pretty steady, trending in a bad direction, but it could be in the margin of error until you hit, COVID. Suicide attempts, pretty steady, a little bit up. And then we're injured in a suicide attempt is basically flat. Now, I will note there's none of these trends that are declining, right? So all of these are bad things for young people, and none of them are declining. All right. So again, from the CDC report, right? This is the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. Percentage of male and female students who experience persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness, right? And you see the kind of, scale difference. So for females, right, it was higher to start with in 2011 at 36%. For males, it's lower. Both of them grew, right? That's a 7% swing. That's a 21% swing for girls, right? So girls clearly experiencing this increase in, persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness considerably more than males do, right? And again, neither of these trends is declining or good or even steady. Okay. Oh, apparently when I took my screenshot, I left the cookie in. 10-year trend, percentage of male and female students considering suicide attempt. Excuse me. And what you see, right? And again, like I said, it's much more pronounced in females than males. Males are basically flat, right? That line is quite flat. You have an 11% increase or girls, right? So plus 11%. So this is a troubling trend. Or mentorship answer. What if adults are given tangible benefits as well, e.g. tax benefits per hour of mentoring? That makes a considerably more appealing answer to that question. I will say that. That is a yes, you would have to give them some kind of benefit because no one well, not no one, but generally speaking, people aren't going to do it out of the goodness of their heart. Maybe some would, but not all. Okay, good question though. Okay, so this one. Again, think of this, right? All of these things that we talked about, back a couple slides ago. We talk about our meaningful interactions per day, right? I'm going to flash back here just so you can have a look at it, right? Meaningful interactions per day, right? We got 66%, 3 or fewer, 3 to 0. Okay, back and back and back to the future. Now I just have to remember where I was. Oh, this one. Okay, so what do we see? Across all of our age brackets, we see declining time spent with friends daily, right? So you want to think your meaningful interactions, right? A lot of those are going to be with friends. So, and then, what is this out of? Oh, the American. So this is out of a different study. This is the American Time Use Study. And by the way, this is where I always want to say, thank God as a sociologist for American social science data. Because one of the amazing things is they've got this thing like, and this is one of like 100 data sets in the US. They're super interesting when it comes to youth. The American Time Use Survey, right? This is something that goes back to the 1960s, I believe, right? Where you can take this data set and look at how people have been spending their time back to like the middle of the 20th century, which is just really amazing. And we don't have anything like this in Canada. And because we over rely on StatsCan to do everything. And StatsCan has a lot of cool stuff, but they don't have this. So American social science data is super cool, and I love it because there's just random people that give money to like do a survey for 80 years, being like, where do you spend your time? Okay, I love American social science data. All right, so let's look here. What do you see? Well, basically, when it comes to time spent with friends, young people, 15 to 24, have always spent the most time with friends, which is, kind of makes sense, right? They're in school, they're with peers a lot of the time, right? They don't work as much, right? Especially when we're talking about the younger part of that sample. So they've always spent more time with friends. They've also seen the biggest drop in time spent with friends of any group, right? So if we go back to 2003, which I will say, what a magical time 2003 was. I was I was in my second year of university of my undergrad in 2003, spending, somewhere in the range of 150 to 155 minutes per day with friends, right? So that's, better than 2 hours, right? Considerably, like 2.5 hours with friends on a daily basis. Older people, right? It's less than an hour typically for our 25 to 34-year-olds. So at least some of those are going to be part of our kind of emerging adult sample. And as you get older, right, you spend less time with friends because you're busier, you have kids, right? You have other obligations. But look at the decline, in terms of our young people. So 155 minutes, right? Up here. By the time you get here, right, to 2018, you've dropped below 100 minutes, right? You're maybe at 90 minutes. By the time you hit 2019, right, so a little bit prior to COVID, you're down at maybe 70 minutes. So you're at less than half, right, in terms of time spent with friends. And obviously this one, 2020 looks like, so this could be COVID numbers, but you're now, below an hour. You're at like 40 minutes, maybe 45 minutes a day with friends. So huge declines, right? 100 minutes less a day with friends for young people. And this big black dark stinky line, right? That's your saturation point with smartphones, right? That's when smartphones really kind of um, take over teenagers and young adults' lives, right? Where they're super saturated and people are spending a lot of time with them. So, and from there, right, you kind of see it's obviously really high here, and it does decline, right? You're below 120 minutes, pops back up, and then never approaches anything close to that again after smartphones are introduced, right? Or they're saturated in terms of young people. So I don't want to blame smartphones and social media for everything, but certainly, right, a big decline there. And two, right, same thing with our 25 to 34. It's not nearly as high. It's just close to an hour around the time that smartphones hit that kind of saturation. And then it starts to drop off after that, not as dramatically, but still. Okay. Okay. So that's a good question. For the time you study, did they include communication through social media, video calling? For the purposes of this, they do not, right? They don't include that. This is embodied time, right? This is where you're actually with people. So yeah, no FaceTime. They Skype, and then I realized that makes me sound really old. And Microsoft just shut Skype off completely, and it no longer exists, making me feel even older. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. I remember when Skype was the only video calling service around, and that's sad. So, markers of mental illness. So, some of our markers of serious mental illness are increasing, and more teenagers are reporting depression and other diagnosed mental illnesses than at any time. So the speed of growth, right? Because one of the objections that comes, and I know Height gets this a lot, I know Twenge gets this a lot, and other people who've kind of pointed to this get this criticism a lot, is that okay, maybe it's just that Gen Z is so much more sort of attuned with mental health and they're more open to talking about it. And that's possible, but if you see the kind of speed of the growth, it suggests something else, right? It suggests that there's some kind of external factor driving a lot of this growth, unless we really think that, in previous generations, um there was so much, even back in those salty old days of 2008, people were just so afraid of talking about things like anxiety and depression. Okay, so what do we see here, right? US percentage of anxiety prevalence, and this is the National Survey of Drug Use and Health. And I'm trying to remember who does this one. I want to say might be the NIH. Okay, anyway, so our 18 to 25-year-olds, right? What have we seen? 92% increase in prevalence of anxiety since 2010, right? So right around here. And you see these lines before are pretty flat. Okay, and as you could go back further, and they're still pretty flat, even further back. Here, US percent of US undergrads diagnosed with a mental illness, right? Anxiety and depression split out for differences. And again, you see a big jump right around 2012. Starts a little bit before maybe, but it really picks up. And this is American College Health Association National College Health Assessment. Like I said, Americans have just a ton of social science data, which is really fun and really cool. But you see 134% increase in anxiety and 100% increase in depression since 2010. ADHD, right, has risen too, but it's smaller to start with. And then other things like bipolar disorder, anorexia, substance abuse or addiction, and with schizophrenia, they've all risen, but those lines are still, the numbers are pretty small. So those lines still look pretty flat. Okay. I'm sorry. I have too many charts on here. But I don't want to do one per slide. All right. So, statistically significant growth in self-harm and suicide amongst our 10 to 19-year-olds, and a bigger increase for females than males, but males commit suicide more often, right? So, all right, I'll explain that in a sec. So, teens admitted to hospital for non-fatal self-harm. What do you see? Again, a big growth, 48% increase since 2010 for girls, 37% increase for boys. Now, the nice thing about this, right? If there's a nice thing about self-harm statistics, which there really isn't, is that it's a really objective measure, right? It's not like self-reported or we think people are talking about it more. Hospitals have collected self-harm data for decades, right? And so we can, and it's, did someone come in showing signs of self-harm? It's noted. If they didn't, obviously it's not noted. So this is a very objective measure. It's not one that's easily susceptible to reporting, because it's, bureaucracy keep this data very carefully. U.S. teens admitted for non-fatal self-harm, and this is our 10 to 14-year-olds, right? So these are very young. And we see again, girls 188% increase since 2010, boys a 48% increase. And this is this is admittances per thousand, I think, or 100,000, right? So you have almost 450 admissions per 100,000. And here, right, it's for our older group, it's something more in the range of about 700 by the end of this, right, per 100,000, as compared to, it's 500 at the beginning and it bottoms out at 400 there. So definitely has risen, right? And we have more instances of being admitted for self-harm for both our 15 to 18-year-olds, or 15 to 19, and our 10 to 14-year-olds. Okay, teen suicides. And again, well, it's depressing, and it's very sad. The good thing about suicide statistics is they too are extremely objective, right? Governments keep careful track of suicide statistics for obvious reasons, and it's not one that's particularly susceptible to self-reporting. So, unlike maybe anxiety and depression, where it's like, okay, maybe people talk about it more today, suicide, cause of death given by the coroner, that's what gets tracked. And what do you see, right? Increase. Boys are up 34% in that 15 to 19. Girls are up 82%. Boys 10 to 14 are up 109%. Girls up 134%. Now, typically, we see more suicides amongst boys for a couple of reasons. One of them is type of suicide. So you tend to have more suicide attempts that are successful amongst boys because they tend to use more violent means, especially in the US. This includes firearms, right? Firearms, knives, and other more violent means, whereas girls are more likely to try to induce it using medication, which is less successful. So they're more likely to be admitted for suicide attempts. Okay. Lest we think our American brethren are somehow, unique here. This is Canada. We don't have as good of statistics here. This one comes out of a collaborative review, and this is again looking at some really objective data. So emergency department visits for Ontario teens, that these involve for self-harm, right? So these are self-harm visits for teens. And what do we see, right? Same thing, since 2010, girls admitted for self-harm more frequently, and as are boys, although boys, right, that line looks much flatter, there's still considerably less of it. Okay, I lost my clock. Okay. Now this one is, these last two are a little bit less objective, right? Because obviously this is sort of self-report. This is asking things on a survey, right? So this is the Canadian Community Health Survey, and we got a good amount of data, right? 2003 to 2019. And what do we see, right? So Canadian women, well, if we go back to those heady days of 2003, when the world was fresh, new, and beautiful, and I was not as old as I am now. I was like 21. I still had hair. It was wonderful. It's the greatest time of all. I just met my wife. It was wonderful. Okay, so our 15 to 30-year-olds, right, were the happiest. All right, so they're happier than their, what is it, 31 to 46-year-old peers and their 47-year-old plus peers, which is a big stretch, like a big grouping, 47 plus, but whatever. So they're happier a little bit. And what happens, right? They start to decline after 2009, right? And by 2019, so 10 years later, and again, prior to COVID, they're the least happy, and not by a little bit. They're the least happy by quite a significant measure. Right? Their happiness has declined a ton. For men, it's not quite as dramatic, but again, back in 2003, they were happier than anyone else. And again, by 2019, they're less happy, not by as big of a measure, right? Women's happiness has clearly declined considerably more. They were about the same, right? Back in 2003, they were about the same. And then by 2019, things have really shifted. For men, a little bit, right? Decrease of 15% compared to a 29% decrease for women. So about half as much. All right. Okay. And yeah. So younger Canadians, obviously, we see declines across the board. Although the 47 pluses are pretty steady for the women, right? Somewhat more unshakable, and for the men too, right? They kind of start around the 70 mark and they end around the 70 mark. But for our younger cohorts, right, it declines much more. And this manifests in lots of ways, more hospitalizations for mental health related conditions being among them. Could also be the changing definitions of disorders in the DSM that affect mental illness rates across generations. I mean, potentially. I'm trying to think when the DSM-4 versus the DSM-5. Does anyone remember the dates for the publication of the DSM-5? I want to say it's like 2013 or 2014, but I can't remember. I don't, and the classification, especially for depression and anxiety, I don't believe has changed that much between the DSMs. She's looking it up. I'm just gonna sip my tea for a second. So 2013? Okay. So, I mean, in here, right? Maybe that's plausible. Although, okay, people reporting they're in very good mental health, probably not. And these again, these are very objective. So maybe for anxiety and depression, perhaps you could be seeing a difference in terms of the DSM. I actually have to go read the DSM-4 and the DSM-5 and see how different it was. If I recall, especially for depression, it's not significantly different. So I don't think so, but I will. Maybe I'll check and we'll see. Okay. It's a good question though. Okay. The UK. So, Britain, Wales, England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. Similar kind of trend, right? Happiness trends in the UK for our ages 10 to 15, right? And this is the Good Childhood Report from 2022, and merging it with data from the adolescent mental or mood disorders since 2010. And what do we see, right? Happiness trends. So this is scored out of 10, right? From 0 to 10, this is happiness. And what do you see? Again, a decline in happiness, more amongst girls, girls who went from 8.16 to 7.47, an 8% decline. Boys declined 4% in the same span. Similar kind of thing with anxiety and depression amongst our 11 to 15-year-olds, increases since 2004 across the board for anxiety and depression for both boys and girls. Although again, girls, they're higher to start with, and it grows. Well, I guess for anxiety, it grows a little bit less. Boys' anxiety grows more. Depression for girls grows considerably more. And then again, our really objective measure here, UK teen self-harm hospitalizations for 13 to 16-year-olds, right? It takes a big jump, especially for girls, right? A 78% increase. Um, I'm trying to think. It's a quote in iGen, and I can't remember it exactly because I don't photographic memory quite. Um, I remember they were talking. It was a quote from a New York doctor, right, talking about girls' emergency room visits, and basically suggesting that every weekend there was a kind of flood of girls being admitted to emergency rooms in New York City for self harm, and it usually was stemming from some kind of incident on social media, right? Either someone had said something nasty about them. There was an attack on their reputation happening on Instagram in particular. But that this is where Twangy certainly thinks a lot of this comes from is from shifts in behavior and social media. We'll talk about this when we talk about technology in the last kind of unit on Wednesday. Um, Girls are more affected by social media than boys are because they care. Well, okay, how to put this, because girls' aggression is more relational than boys is. Boys tend to have much more physical aggression, right? Externalizing aggression, whereas girls tend to have more relational aggression. So both boys and girls are quite aggressive in lots of ways. Okay. I was about to try and do an Australian accent, and then I realized that would turn out terrible. And it would sound like the croc hunter guy, and I don't think that's certainly from my Australian friends. I don't think that guy is representative of all Australians or their accents. Okay, ner. I know they can't say no. Australians always say ner for some reason. Okay, self poisoning, Australia. Again, pretty objective measure. Again, tracked by hospitals and collected by the state. So self poisoning is up. Why is my phone? Overnight psychiatric emergency department visits, right? Up quite a bit, 81% for females 12 to 24. For 25 plus, it's 7 plus, up 7%. For males 25 plus, it's up 17, and up 51% for males, 14 or 12 to 24. And again, this is per 100 visits per 100,000. Self harm, and hospitalizations for Australian females, doesn't rise as substantially, especially not in these other cohorts, but definitely took a little bit of a jump, following that kind of 2012 magic number. And psychological distress, right? Percentage of 16 plus reported very high psychological distress on the Australia's Health Snapshot Mental Health of Young Australians survey, and that's out of 2022. And again, this is, data that goes back to the early 2000s. And you see the kind of hockey stick shaped line for females 16 to 24, right? So hockey stick shape, right? It's like shaped like a hockey stick, kind of flat at the bottom and takes a big jump. One of the things I'll say with hockey stick shaped graphs, if you know anything kind of about trends in social science, they're weird. Things don't usually move in hockey sticks, right? This is really normal. This part here, this looks really, really normal, right? If I was looking at long-term trends in anything, that looks really normal. It's kind of bumpy, right? It bumps along, goes up, down, based on things like sample, who's in the sample, what's going on. This big jump looks really weird. Things don't usually jump unless there's some kind of external causative agent. And so I think it's reasonable to assume that there's some kind of external causation there. All right. All right. Let's get really controversial. Um, so politics seems to play a big role as well, for whatever reason. And I don't know that I particularly understand the mechanism that's going on here. I will suggest what I think it could be, but I'm certainly open to other interpretations. What politics does, and again, this is from put together by Jonathan Haidt, and this this is so this is from Pew Research, and this is from another great study, Monitoring the Future, which again has data going back to the 70s. So what do we see here?
Has a doctor or healthcare provider ever told you you have a mental condition? Percentage saying yes. And you see, right, um, that there's a big split when it comes to kind of conservative, moderate, or liberal, right? So they kind of split this up. They ask them about their political affiliation. And what you see is, right, it's about 20%, let's say in our really interesting cohort for us, right, 20% of young women, 15% of young men who are conservative. When you move over to the moderate category, it's up a little bit, right? In terms of age, it's closer to 30% for moderate. When you get to liberal, it's way higher, right? You're above 50% in the moderate category for women, for young women, and for men, right, you're over 30%, which is, higher than women in either of the other two categories, or men in other two categories. So politics seems to play a role. Now it's unclear. It could be that, there's more like you must be stoic and hard and not talk about things, right? Suck it up, die a death of despair, and don't whine to anyone about it. That's possible. And there's less of a machismo here, more openness. I think that's possible. Okay. Um, Depression scores by gender, right? So this is from Monitoring the Future. And Monitoring the Future looks at people exiting high school, right? So they do a survey when people are exiting high school. And you see the same kind of pattern, right? When you kind of track politics into it, your highest depression scores are for female and male liberal, with female and male conservative considerably lower, right? I can't remember what this score is out of. Oh, it's out of 5, right? So considerably higher when you track that. So politics seems to play a role. On most measures, those identifying as liberal politically have worse mental health kind of outcomes. Okay, I'm going to suggest a possible interpretation of this data. So self-derogation. We're going to look at another kind of score here, and this one is out of Monitoring the Future as well. So it looks at people's agreement with these 4 statements, right? So I feel I do not have much to be proud of. Sometimes I think I'm no good at all. I feel I can't do anything right. And I feel my life is not very useful. These are self-derogation statements. You're shit talking yourself, right? That's sort of what self-derogation means. All right, so what do we see here, right? So scores for self-derogation, right, in US 12th graders. Well, again, we see a much higher prevalence, right? And so it runs from 1 to 5, right? So liberal boys and liberal girls are above 2.5, trending towards 3, and conservative girls and conservative boys are far less likely to say this. Okay. So again, politics seems to track onto this a little bit. What I think is kind of interesting here is here. Okay, so whenever I try to get ahead, something or somebody stops me. And again, US 12th graders. And what do we see, right? So this is split between boys and girls. Liberal girls and conservative boys are the most likely to say essentially that they can't get ahead, right? That whenever they try to do something, something gets in the way. So one of the things I would suggest, especially about this last chart, and in terms of like mental health outcomes, is that both liberal girls and conservative boys seem to be manifesting what's called an external locus of control. So essentially what an external locus of control is a sense that you're not in control of your own life, that there are forces beyond yourself that are controlling, how your life is going to go, and essentially stopping you from succeeding, right? So it becomes this thing where your success or failure is not down to you, it's down to these external forces. And an external locus of control is a very depressing state, right? Now, if you have an internal locus of control, you feel like you are in control of your life in some meaningful way, right? So you feel empowered. If you have an external locus of control, you feel disempowered, right? And you feel like There's nothing you're going to be able to do to improve your life. And I think, interestingly, and I don't have it, this is just a theory. I don't have any data to sort of confirm this. We have a sort of weird coinciding phenomenon between liberal girls and boys. In both cases, I think there's like internal dialogues within these groups. They're telling them that there are powerful forces that are stopping them from succeeding, right? And so you can think of like the red pill, right, and kind of manosphere movements amongst young men, right? That are like, okay, the problem with the world is my coming close to mentioning Andrew Tate really that funny? Okay. Right, but someone like Andrew Tate or other these red pill folks suggesting to young men the problem with their lives and why, they can't get girlfriends and jobs and all of this is because of, feminism, right? This kind of shifts that locus of control to some kind of external force or, the World Economic Forum or, whatever it happens to be, right? Academics, who the hell knows? Um, I accidentally fell down the manosphere kind of hole because I heard people talking about Andrew Tate and I was like, who the hell's Andrew Tate? And so I searched for Andrew Tate on YouTube and I watched a couple of videos and I'm like, icky, gross. And then for weeks and months later, I was being served up like red pill manosphere content on YouTube because I just searched for it. And it's like, well, you must be interested. And I'm like, really not, please stop. I had to like physically go through on YouTube and be like, not interested in this video for like a month until YouTube's algorithm sort of figured that out. Okay, so that's boys. I think here, right, potentially for girls, there's this sense that, talking about the patriarchy and how women are oppressed might have that same sort of effect of creating an external locus of control, right? You can't get ahead because there are these powerful external forces, the patriarchy, that's kind of affecting you, and it'll manifest kind of in this sort of movement. Now, again, I'm just theorizing, right? If I'm interpreting the data, that's kind of how I read it. But I think it's kind of interesting. But there definitely is a kind of interesting political split. Oh, and here. Um, One of the other things, and I almost included this in dating because this kind of goes to dating as well. We're seeing an increasingly wide ideological gap opening up between young men and young women in countries across the world. So again, we're not special in the West in any sense, right? So political ideology of 18 to 29-year-olds, percentage liberal minus percentage conservative, and you see this kind of divergence, right? So what does this tell us? Well, girls are getting more liberal. And boys are getting more conservative. So, I mean, this has all sorts of effects as well. One of them being a kind of values mismatch, right? Wow, South Korean boys have gotten way more conservative. That's crazy. In the U.S., it's much more mild. The UK looks funny. It's like two snakes dancing. I don't know why. It just looks like that to me. So you have this divergence. Now, again, how long this lasts, how durable this is a bit of a question. This has been going on, apparently since 2005 in South Korea. And, I mean, I guess men aren't that much more conservative in the US than they were in 1990. It's just that women have gotten much more liberal in that sense. This divergence is going to cause other problems, right? In terms of values alignments, it's going to be much harder to find, if you're looking for a romantic partner, someone that aligns with you politically and socially, because they're diverging in such marked ways, especially in South Korea, apparently. Okay. How many slides do I have left? What time is it? Okay. Let me just double check. I think I'm almost done. I have one slide left. So let's and liberals want to change me feel more uncertain and hopeless. I don't know that that's true. I think, I mean, certainly all the conservatives that I know are incredibly depressed about the world at this particular moment, but that could just be me. Potential factor: more minority groups already have worse outcomes identifying as liberal. It depends on the minority group. If you actually look at, like, in the US especially, African Americans or Black people, Latinos are actually considerably more conservative than their white counterparts, for lots of reasons, especially on social values. So I don't know that that tracks. Certainly there are some who are more liberal, but actually white people are the most liberal of all, especially in the US. Canada, I'm not sure because I haven't actually looked. Conservatives want things to remain the same. They're more content in the present. Yeah, that I don't know. I don't know if that's true. Well, I mean, I think they want things to remain the same. I think that's true. That's the definition of a conservative. But like I said, most of the conservatives I know are perpetually Eeyore, right? Everything is terrible. Everything is bad. Yes, gender and sexual minorities for sure would be more liberal. I think that kind of goes with the territory. There are some log cabin Republicans. Those are the gay Republicans in the US, but there are not a ton of them. Okay. Clear that out. For the final cues, would you like us to include more stats? Lectures are more stat heavy. Feel free. Absolutely. They're there for you. Use them as you like. They're definitely good backing for your answers. Okay. All right. So social media use might play a role, right? And we don't, we have this out of the UK, right? Put together by Height and Twenge. Percentage of UK teens depressed as a function of social media hours. And yeah, when they have none, right? There's still some that are depressed, but it's the more you get towards 5 hours or more a day, it certainly gets worse. And I know in Twenge's book, iGen, she suggested that the kind of magic number was about 2 hours a day. It's 2 hours a day on social media, because less than that, people felt isolated from their peers, right? Social media is so prevalent in terms of Gen Z that less than 2 hours a day, they felt isolated. More than 2 hours a day, and you started to see those effects. And I think this chart kind of bears that out, certainly amongst boys, right? And girls, you get a little bit of a rise, but that really sharp rise comes after 2 hours a day. Okay. That's an interesting question. So here's the funny thing. In the US, racial minorities do tend to vote for the Democrats. However, if you poll them on their actions, okay, if you want to find the group in the US that is the most opposed, say, to same-sex marriage, it's black people, most opposed to same-sex marriage, right? Latinos are not very far behind, right? So from a perspective, like, they're very socially conservative, but they continue to vote Democrat. And okay, now we're getting into, like, my hobby, which is politics, and you've put me in political junkie territory. You started to see this swing with Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump got the highest percentage of Black and Latino voters of pretty much any Republican in a really long time. For what, maybe they just like him because he's, I don't know why. I can't explain why anyone likes Donald Trump. But yeah, racial minorities tend to vote Democrat, but in terms of their actual, like, values, a lot of them are quite socially conservative, right? And when it comes to things like, LGBTQ rights, same-sex marriage, even kind of feminism, and questions of, like, women's equality, they're much more conservative than a lot of their white peers. For the final, will it be the same format as your midterm? Actually, I'll be hosting a interpretive dance competition in the CCR. You must come and do an interpretive dance that explains the course's themes to me. The judging will be 100% subjective. The test will be held from 6 p.m. till midnight on the day of no. Yes, it's the same. Sorry, it's the same format. Online, 5 questions, all that. Please don't send me videos of your interpretive dance, or do actually. I will cherish them forever. Okay. I think was that it for me? I'm done. Okay. Did I get my last slide? No, I can't tell. I got stuck with my own joke, which is one of my problems. I got my last slide in, right? Yes, I did. Okay, perfect. Little break. Let's take like 15 minutes, and then we'll come back. I got a documentary to make you watch, to watch you make. I know, make you watch. And then that'll lead us into our topic on Wednesday, where we'll close out the course talking about young people and technology and some of the kind of pressing questions that we're seeing around things like smartphones, social media, video games. We'll talk a little bit about porn again, but not too much, and what it's doing to both boys and girls in different ways. So yeah, take 15 minutes, come back at 2:45, and we'll get this queued up for you. It'll be great, I promise. For those watching online, I cannot stream this on YouTube or I will get copyright strike. So it's called The Social Dilemma. You can find it on Netflix. Okay, you can leave. That's fine. Who's stealing my thunder, making people watch this without me? Oh.
I was the co-inventor.